Hey guys, Danny here again. So today we will be talking about using P5 to create our own drawing tools using interaction and the mouse. So basically we're going to be able to use the mouse and find the mouse's position, the X and Y coordinates for the mouse. And then we can have a object follow that X and Y position wherever that mouse or the cursor goes. So today we are going to be talking about some variables that come standard with P5 and processing. So the mouse variables are mouseX and mouseY. That gives us the X and Y location of where the mouse is on the screen. pmouseX and pmouseY is the previous position of where that mouse position was in the last frame. Then we're going to talk about some functions when it comes to mouse interactions. So there's mouse pressed, mouse released, and mouse dragged. We're going to briefly talk about booleans as well, which are true or false statements. And then there's some standard booleans that come with P5 out of the box. There's mouseIsPressed and mouse button. Then there are some other mouse-related functions, cursor-related functions. There's no cursor if you don't want to see the cursor. Cursor if you want to change what the cursor looks like. We're going to use the map function to map the values of the cursor location to something else. We're going to use the constrain function, the distance function, and the save function to save our designs that we're creating. Then we're going to use some math methods, some equations to figure out when we have a hover state. For instance, if there's a hover state on a button, then we can change the color, or we could say on click on that button it does something. We're going to figure out how to do easing. So basically follow the mouse and then have an object go from point A to point B, but in a like going fast and then slow again. That's easing. And then we could do some speed detections. So basically we want to determine how fast the mouse, the cursor is moving on the screen. We can calculate that based off of the previous position of the mouse and the current position of the mouse. Cool. So let's open up our P5 web editor, and we're going to play around with some of these examples. So the first one we're going to play around with is just the mouse X and mouse Y position for, in this case, an ellipse. So let's go to our web editor, our P5 web editor, and create a new project. And let's create a canvas. I'm going to do 600 by 400. And let's create a background. I'm just going to do 0. Let's do no stroke, just so we don't have any strokes around our ellipse. And then for the background for draw, I'm just going to delete that for now, because we want to basically see every single frame that we're when we are drawing the object. So the next thing I'm going to do is create a fill for our ellipse that we're going to create. And let's make it 255. So white with a 50% opacity. Okay. And then we're going to do an ellipse. And instead of passing in an X and Y value that's static, we're going to use mouseX and mouseY. And we could do any size. I'm just going to do 50 and 50. Okay, so let's press play. And if you move your mouse around, then you can see that there's an ellipse being drawn every frame. And it's going to be drawn wherever your mouse is, wherever your cursor is. So let's stop that, and I'm going to play it again. So as you can see on the top, there is a little bit of an issue. The ellipse is being drawn initially at the 0, 0 point. So you can see that there is on the upper left-hand corner of the canvas, there is a ellipse that just shows up half on the screen right when we start the sketch. So to fix that, we're going to do this. We're going to start the ellipse off the screen. So basically we're going to initialize the value of mouseX and mouseY to be the negative value of the diameter of the ellipse. So we're going to create a variable at the top for d for diameter, and then use that variable for the initialization value of mouseX and mouseY. And then obviously use that d value for the size of the ellipse as well. So let's go back. And at the top, we're going to say var d equals 50. And then inside setup, because we have to do this inside setup because mouseX is a p5 variable, and it has to be inside setup or draw to be recognized, essentially. So mouseX equals -d, and mouseY equals -d. And then let's replace 50 with just d and d. Now when we hit play, you can see that the top doesn't have the ellipse sticking through anymore on load. So it's just an empty stage, an empty canvas, and then when you move your cursor on, that's when the ellipse pops on again. So that's the best thing to do if you are doing something that you want to use as a drawing tool, but you don't want it to show up when you start the sketch. You basically start it off the canvas. Cool. So the next thing we're going to do is play around with offset. Offset is basically just allows you to create a more complex brush that can have multiple elements associated with it. So basically all we're going to do is create a bunch of ellipses, and we're going to offset each one of those ellipses to be a little above, a little below, and a little to the left and to the right of where the mouse X and Y value is. So we're going to do mouseX plus D and then mouseX minus D. So that's going to move from the left and to the right of the mouseX position. And then for the other one, we're going to do mouseY plus D and mouseY minus D to move it up and down as well. So we're going to have kind of make a diamond shaped with 4 ellipses. Okay, so I'm going to change this now to be, instead of 50, let's do 20. Let's make it a little bit smaller. Feel free to start a new sketch too if you want to save the last one and then start a new one. And then I'm just going to copy and paste. So Command C and then Command V 4 times. So these are 4 ellipses that right now are in the same position. They're just on top of each other. So let's change that, and let's offset each one of these from the mouse X and mouse Y position. So the first one, let's do mouse X plus D, and then the second one is mouse X minus D. So let's look and see what that looks like. Okay, that's interesting. So there's 2, one to the left and one to the right. And then let's go back and change mouse Y for the third and fourth to be mouse Y plus D and mouse Y minus D. Okay, cool. So now we have an offset and a little bit more interesting brush too. Obviously you can get more creative with that too. You can do different shapes. It doesn't have to be an ellipse. It doesn't have to be the same dimensions. It doesn't have to be the same color or the same opacity. So you could play around with customizing whatever you want to do for that specific brush. So next we're going to move on from mouseX and mouseY to pmouseX and pmouseY. So basically that is going to give us the previous mouse position in the previous frame. So if we know the current mouseX and mouseY position and the previous mouseX and mouseY position, then we can use it to basically, instead of drawing ellipses, we can connect the points of a line to make it look like we're drawing like a pencil or pen effect. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to stop this. Again, feel free to save this as a different sketch and then start fresh with a new one. I'm just going to delete what I have here and start from scratch. Okay. So for this, we're going to be playing around with the line function. So we do want to have a stroke. So I'm going to say the stroke is going to be white and the background is black. Let's do a stroke weight. I'm doing this all in setup because I'm not going to be changing any of these in draw. But you could put this on draw and it would be fine. Stroke is 3, stroke weight is 3. And then in draw, we're going to just basically draw a line. But again, instead of having a X and Y for the first and second point, that's static, we're going to use mouseX and mouseY for the first X and Y coordinate, and then pmouseX and pmouseY for the second X and Y coordinate. So now if we hit play, we should be able to draw something like use a marker like brush to draw something instead of just an ellipse. So this is basically connecting the previous mouse location with the current mouse location to draw a line. Okay. Next. So we're going to play around with mapping the value of the mouse X and mouse Y position. Or in this case, we're just going to map the value of mouse X to be the angle of the rotation of this triangle. So we are going to create a variable for a triangle, and in our draw we're going to apply the value for that angle to be using the map function, and then we're going to pass in the current value for the mouse X, and we're going to say, okay, initially the range is between 0 and the width of the canvas. But we want to make this between 0 and 2 pi for the rotation of this triangle. So basically, as we go from left to right, we're going to rotate this triangle, I believe, 360 degrees. Okay, so let's try that. Okay, so again, feel free to save this and then start from scratch. I'm just going to delete everything I don't need, and then start from scratch. So the first thing I want to do is create a variable for my angle. And then I am going to say no stroke in here, because I just want to have a fill on the triangle. And then we are going to actually have a background this time, because we only want to see the current frame that we're on. And that's going to be a black background. And why don't we draw the triangle first? So I'm going to draw the triangle using the triangle function. And the first point's going to be 0, and for the x, negative 95 for the y, then 75 and 65, and then negative 75 and 65. All right, let's play that. Great. Just give this a fill too. 255. Okay, so it's white. I guess it's white by default. All right, so the next thing we want to do, I'm going to translate this. I like drawing any sort of abstract shape at the 0, 0 point first, because it's a lot less of a headache to figure out the x and y coordinates for like a triangle or a quadrilateral, starting at 0, 0, and then translating it using the translate function to place it where I want it to be on the canvas. So I'm going to translate the triangle to be at the center point of the canvas. So width divided by 2 and height divided by 2. Okay, great, center. And then I'm going to create our angle and set that equal to the map function. And then how this map function works is you could pass in 5 values here. The first value is going to be the value you want to change or remap. So that's going to be mouseX. Then the second and third are the original min and max, essentially. So we're starting at 0 for mouseX and then going to width, the full width of the browser, or sorry, full width of the canvas. And then we want to remap that to be between 0 and 2 pi, which I believe is 360 degrees. Okay, so now let's pass that angle value into rotate. Okay, so we are mapping the mouseX value, remapping it to go from the 0 to width value to be between 0 and 360 degrees. So let's see if that works. All right. So now when we move the cursor from left to right, it's going to rotate the triangle a full 360 degrees from 0, mouseX at 0 to mouseX at the full width of the canvas. All right, great. If you are uncomfortable using pi, you can also probably use radians and 360, which basically allows you to pass in a specific degree. So 360 degrees and radians should do the same thing. Yeah, so that looks good too. So those are 2 options. You can use 2 pi or radians 360. So the next thing is playing around with hover states. So this is basically just using an if statement to say when the mouse is in a certain location, we can change, in this case, the position of the rectangle. So the mouse is, when the mouseX is less than width divided by 2, meaning when the mouse is on the left-hand side, the rectangle is going to be drawn on the left-hand side, starting at 0, 0. Else, so when mouseX is greater than width divided by 2, then the rectangle is going to be drawn on the right-hand side. Okay. So again, I'm going to delete all of this, except for background. And start from scratch. Again, feel free to save and create a new document if you would like to keep the previous example. So let's create, let's just add a fill for our rectangle, a white background. Stop that. And then we're going to say if mouseX is less than width divided by 2, we're asking a question, and we want to do something else. We want to do something else. So if mouseX is less than width divided by 2, then let's draw a rectangle on that side of the screen. So that's going to be at 0, 0. And let's just do the full half of the screen. So width divided by 2 for the width, and then height for the height of the rectangle. And then if the mouse is on the right side of the screen, then we want to draw the rectangle on the right side of the screen. So we're going to start drawing it at width divided by 2. The y is going to be 0. And then the size is going to be the same. So width divided by 2 and height. Okay. So let's play that. So we have the rectangle on the left-hand side now, because I'm hovering over the left-hand side. But if I hover over the right-hand side, then it's going to switch. So the rectangle's on the right. Go back to the left. The rectangle's on the left. Go back to the right. The rectangle's on the right. So that's the basics behind creating like a button or any sort of hover interaction. It's basically just using if statements to determine if the cursor, if the mouse is in that particular area, then we want to do something. If it's not in that particular area, then we don't want to do anything, or we want to do something else. All right. So we could also do this using a Boolean statement, which is just a true or false statement. This is sometimes a helpful way to go about saying if something is true or false. So if I am hovering over a certain area, or if I am not hovering over that area. So we basically have to create a Boolean, which is just a variable. So this one is called hover Boolean, and we're initializing it as being true. So we're saying hover Boolean is true on load. And then for the if statement, we're saying if mouseX is less than width divided by 2, hover Boolean is true, else hover Boolean is false. And then we can use that Boolean statement to say, okay, if hover Boolean is true, then draw the rectangle on the left-hand side. If hover Boolean is false, then draw the rectangle on the right-hand side. Basically the same result from the previous example. It's just using a different method and using a Boolean, which again is a true or false statement. So those are two different options. It depends on the project that you're doing, whether you do one or the other. So the next thing I want to talk about is the mouseIsPressed variable that comes with P5. So that basically just allows us to say, okay, when we are clicking on the mouse, pressing down on the mouse, then we can do something. In this case, we're going to draw something when we click down. Versus before, we didn't have any control over when we were drawing. It's basically whenever the cursor was on the canvas, it was drawing something. But using the mouseIsPressed variable, we can control when we want to start drawing. All right, so let's go ahead and try that one. Okay, so let's go back, and I'm gonna delete everything from draw, and we're gonna use points for this example. So we want to have a stroke, and I'm gonna say that stroke is white. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is say, is write a if statement saying, okay, when the mouse is pressed, so mouse is pressed, then we want to basically draw something. So I'm going to make a more interesting brush style using a for loop. So I'm going to create a for loop, and I'm going to loop through this 10 times to create 10 different points. So I equals 0, I is less than 10, I plus plus. Then I'm going to change the stroke weight of this point based off of the I value. And I'm going to draw this point. X is going to be 0, and then Y, I'm just going to move it down. I times -10. Okay. Okay, nothing's happening because we don't have an X and Y coordinate that is showing up on the screen. So let's change that by adding a translate. We're going to translate this using the mouseX and mouseY position. So let's hit play, and then, okay, so far so good. Now when we click, great. We're able to draw on click rather than constantly drawing whenever the cursor is over the canvas. So we have some more control. So let's try it again. Cool. This kind of gives it like a dimensionality to it. It's kind of 3D effect. And we definitely have a lot more control. Okay. Looks good. So that's mouseIsPressed. Again, it's just a if statement. So if mouse is pressed, then you pass in what you want to draw when the mouse is pressed inside that if statement. So the next function that we're going to play with is the constrain function. So constrain basically just does that. It's constraining the area that you can draw in to a specific area on the screen. So we could say, okay, create a variable from X and Y and constrain the mouseX and mouseY to just be between, for the X, it would be between 100 and 500, and for the Y, it would be between 100 and 300. And then we can have a ellipse that is using that X and Y value, and then it's just going to stay within that region on the screen, so it won't go outside at all. So it won't go below 100 for X and Y, and it won't go above 500 for X and 300 for Y. All right, let's try that. So I'm going to delete this, and we're going to use ellipses. So I'm going to do no stroke. And then in draw, we're going to create our variable for X, set that equal to constrain. And we're going to do mouseX. We're going to constrain constrain X between 100 and 500. And then variable Y equals constrain. And we're constraining mouseY to stay between 100 and 300. And we should probably use mouseIsPressed. Makes much more sense now that we know that exists to use it all the time. And then let's make this a color. So I'm going to do a fill 255, 0, 0. And the ellipse is going to be passing in the X and Y that we created up here, these two variables. Then whatever width and height you want to do. Let's just do 20 and 20. Okay, so now when I play this and I click and drag, it's only going to stay within this frame here. So we can't go outside of that frame at all. So that's kind of nice if you want to have like on the side buttons or something that change your brush color or brush size or brush opacity or brush shape, so nothing will get affected on the outside of this perimeter. So that's a nice little function to know that exists, so you can play around with it a little bit in your own sketches. Okay. So the next function that we're going to play around with is the distance function, dist for distance. And that basically allows us to measure the distance between one point and another. So point A and point B, and the distance between those 2 points. So we're going to create a variable for D here. This is going to be the diameter of our ellipse. And we're going to say, okay, we want to measure the distance between the center, so width divided by 2 and height divided by 2, the center of our canvas, with the mouse position. So how far away is our mouse, our X and Y location of the mouse from the center point? And we're going to apply that value to be the size of this ellipse. So this ellipse is going to grow and shrink as our mouse gets closer and further away from the center point. Okay, so let's give that a go. So I am going to go back in here and delete. Feel free to save this and create a new document too. All right, so in draw, we're gonna create a background this time because we don't want to see every single frame. And it's gonna be 0. And then we're gonna create a variable for D, for the diameter, equals, I guess that technically is gonna be radius, but we'll keep it as D. So D equals dist, the distance function. And then the first value is the X and Y coordinate for the point A, which is the center point, width divided by 2 and height divided by 2. And then point B, we're going to measure the distance between those 2 points. It's going to be mouseX and mouseY. Now we can say, okay, ellipse. Let's draw that at the center point, width divided by 2. Oops, width divided by 2 and height divided by 2. And then we're going to use that D value to change the size. And this is going to be, so we're basically calculating the radius, so center to the exterior of the ellipse. But we want this to be the diameter. So we're going to say D times 2 and D times 2. Oh, and let's give this a fill too. Let's do red again. Okay, stop that and play. So now as we bring the cursor closer to the center point, the ellipse should get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until we get to the center point. And then as we go away from the center point, it's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So it's calculating the distance between the cursor and the center point. And then we're using that value and applying it to the size, the diameter of this ellipse that's growing and shrinking as I move the mouse closer to this and further away from the center point. Cool. So the next thing that we can play around with, now that we have talked about distance and a few other things, we can play around with easing. So for easing, we are basically going to say, okay, we're going to start the movement of, in this case, the ellipse. And it's going to go fast initially, and then as it gets closer to the current position of the cursor, it's going to slow down and get slower and slower and slower as it gets closer and closer and closer. So we're creating a variable for X and set that to be equal to 0 initially. And then we're creating a variable for easing, and that's going to be a decimal point. In this case, it's going to be 0.07. So in draw, we are going to create another variable called target X and set that initially to be mouseX. And then we're going to say, okay, X, which initially is 0, plus equals target X minus X times easing. And then we're going to pass that X value into the X value for ellipse. And this is basically going to update and change the movement of that ellipse as it's going towards the moving cursor. So let's play around with that. And I'm going to delete some stuff in there. Again, feel free to save this and create a new document. So at the top, we're going to say var x equals 0 and var easing equals 0.07. And you could play around with that value to see the difference in what like 0.1 versus 0.01 would be once we put this together. So one would be faster and one would be slower. So in draw, let's say we're gonna have a fill. Let's stick with red. I like red and black. And then we're gonna create a variable for our target x. So where the ellipse is gonna end up eventually, mouseX. And then x plus equals, so it's basically finding what x currently is and then updating it with a new value. Target x minus x times easing. And then we're going to draw our ellipse, use that x variable value for the x location, and then the height divided by 2 is just going to be in the center point. And let's say it's going to be 40 by 40. Okay, so let's move the cursor. So as you move it left to right, the ellipse is going to follow the cursor on the x-axis, but it's going to start off fast and then start to get slower as it gets to the current position of the cursor. So that's some nice easing. And we could play around with the value. Let's see what 0.1 does. So it just speeds it up a little bit, so it gets to the cursor a little faster. 0.01. It's just going to take a lot longer for it to get to that point. So you can play around with the easing value that makes most sense for your project. It's a little slow. So now we could play around with all these and figure out how we can generate a value for speed. So basically how fast our cursor is moving on the canvas. All right, so for this, then we're going to create a variable for speed, set that equal to 0. We're going to have some easing as well, set that equal to 0.03. And then we're going to create a variable for x and y. In draw, we're going to create a target, and that is going to be equal to the distance between the current mouse location, the current cursor location, and the previous cursor location. And speed is going to be equal to target minus speed times easing. And we're updating the speed value based off of the current value. Then what we're going to do is apply that speed value to the stroke weight of a line that we're going to draw. So the faster your cursor moves, the thicker that line, the thicker the stroke weight is going to be for that line. All right, so let's give that a go. All right, let's again start from scratch. I'm going to delete everything. Oops. Including the background. And then at the top, let's create a variable for speed equals 0. A variable for easing equals, let's do 0.03. And draw, let's create a variable for target. And let's define that as being the distance between the current mouse X and mouse Y position and the previous mouseX and mouseY, sorry, pmouseY position. And then we're going to calculate speed as being plus equals target minus speed, and multiply it by easing. So the easing will just make it a much more fluid transition from one weight to the next. Otherwise it would get really kind of choppy and chunky. Okay, so let's create our if statement for mouseIsPressed. So we can click and drag to draw. And let's create a stroke weight. And we're going to apply speed to that stroke weight. Let's do speed divided by 2 so it doesn't get too thick too quickly. And then we're going to draw our line. mouseX, mouseY, and then pmouseX and pmouseY. Oh, I've forgotten setup. We have no stroke here, and we are using a line, so we need a stroke. So let's change that to stroke used 250. Let's make it red again. 255.00. All right, let's try this. So the faster it goes, the thicker that line's gonna get. And the slower it goes, the thinner it is. Okay. I'm just curious, let's see if we don't use easing. Let's see if it still works the same way. See how it gets like chunky? It's jumping from one thickness to a very different thickness. So that's why we use easing, so it doesn't have that kind of jump. It's much more of a nice, easy, clean transition from one thickness to the next. All right, looks good. Should be creating some more interesting drawings for you guys. This isn't very beautiful. So the next thing I want to talk about is how do we save our beautiful creations. So we could use the save function, but the best thing to do, we're going to talk about key presses more next week in the next video, but the best thing to do is use a key press. So when you click, in this case, I believe this is key code 80 is P, the P key, then we're going to export a JPEG. And we are going to do a count basically to allow us to change the name of the file to be the name of the file, and then 1, the name of the file, 2, name of the file, 3, so we don't override the previous export. So why don't we just do this to the sketch that we just created. Okay, so here let's go back and say, okay, I want to create a variable for my count, set that equal to 1, and then a var, not car, var c for canvas variable. So when we're exporting anything, when we're saving anything from P5, we have to define a variable for the canvas. So we have to say c, the variable c, is equal to create canvas. And then after draw, we are going to create a function called key pressed. And again, we're going to talk about this more in the next video, next week. And this is basically just saying when a key on the keyboard is pressed. And then we want to have an if statement and say, okay, if key code, so all keys have a code, equals 80, which is the code for the P, the P key. So I'm going to say that up here. 80 equals the code for P. So in here we're going to say save canvas C. So that's the canvas at the top that we created a variable for. We give it a name, canvas name. It could be anything you want. I'm going to say plus count. So it'd be canvas name 1, canvas name 2, etc. Then we can define the type of file that we want to export, JPEG. And then I'm going to update count. Count plus plus is just adding 1 to the existing value of count. So if it's 1, then it's going to be 2. If it's 2, then it's going to be 3, etc., etc. All right, so let's play that, see if it works. Hit P. Awesome. And then we could save it as canvas name 1, save it to the desktop. And then we could draw some more. Okay, looks like a very weird looking abstract face with a comb over there. Okay, and then hit P again. Then it's canvas name 2. So every time you hit P, it's gonna update the name with a new number at the end. So we basically aren't gonna override the previous export. So obviously once you stop this and start it again, then count is going to be redefined again, starting at 1. So that's just for fair warning. So once you stop this and restart it, everything gets restarted from the beginning. There's no way to also save your designs and come back to it later, unless you're exporting it as an image. All right, cool. So the next thing I want to talk about is how to create a very simple graphic user interface, or GUI, using a button class that we can create ourselves. So the first thing we want to do is create a couple variables for this button class. So variable brush, we're just going to have a number that represents any number of brushes that we want to have for any number of buttons that we're going to create. Then the B here represents button. So BX is the button X location, BY is the Y location, BW is the width, BH is the height. And then here I have 2 buttons. And BY2 is based off of the first BY's location and just moving it down a little bit. And then creating a variable B1 and B2 for our buttons, our 2 buttons. This is the button class, so I called it interface. Again, any classes usually start with a capital letter, so capital I interface. And then we're passing in a couple values into this, this class. So we can have an X and Y location, a width and a height for the button. Then a C1 and C2 is basically saying, okay, the hover state for the button is going to be C1, and the on load state is going to be a color of C2. Then B is going to be the number that represents the button you're on, and B size is the size of, in this case, the ellipse. So you could change the size of the ellipse for the button. Oh, sorry, for the brush. So once that's created, then we can create our buttons here. So B1 equals new interface. And then we're creating the button by passing in an X and a Y, a width and a height, a hover color and a load color for the button, a numerical value to represent that button, and then a size for, in this case, the ellipse And there's two different buttons here and two different brushes that are attached to those buttons. Then in draw, we are creating the button and then also creating the brush for both B1 and B2. Okay, so rather than write all that together, I'm just going to share with you the example code and then show you how to create a new button. So let's go to GUI with buttons example. Okay, so if I run this, then I have two buttons up here. And when I click on it, it's going to change, the button's going to change the color, and then I'm going to get a brush here. If I click on the red one, the button's going to change color, and then I get a new brush. So this basically just allows me to toggle through between two different brushes. Cool. So let's say I wanted to add another one. So to add a new one, I am going to create a new variable, var by3 equals by2 plus bh plus 10. So it's just moving it down a little bit. Then I can create a new button here. So b3 equals new interface. And then I'm going to pass in bx is the same, by is going to be by3, bw, bh, and then the color for the button, let's do, so this is when you click on it. So let's do a color variable, sorry, a color function with 0, 100, 0. That's going to be greenish. And then for the button on load, I'm going to do a green button. So 0, 255, and 0. And then let's give this value. This brush is going to be a value of 2. And let's make it 30 pixels in diameter. Okay, now in draw, I can reference B3 button, B3 brush, and then in the actual class itself, you can say, okay, if B equals 2, fill green with an opacity of 50%. Okay, let's see if that works. Okay, now we have 3 buttons. That's good. So we have a red one, we have a white one, and a green one. Yeah, cool. So basically all I'm saying is when the red brush or 0 brush is clicked on, then it's going to be a red brush, a red fill for this ellipse. If B equals 1, then it's going to be a white fill for this ellipse. If B equals 2, then it's going to be a green fill for this ellipse. So the only thing we're changing here is the color, the fill color of the ellipse. But everything else is just that single ellipse. All right, cool. So I'll share that link to this example with you on the class website, as well as on the YouTube description. So feel free to use that for your homework assignment. Another option would be to use this pretty amazing library that was created by the wonderful people at Google. This is called dat.GUI. And it's a JavaScript graphic user interface library that allows you to really easily attach sliders and color pickers and on-off buttons and drop-downs and text fields and buttons to your P5 sketch. If you go to the link on our class website for the dat.GUI example, I'll also put it on the description for the YouTube video. If you go to that example, then you can see an index.html. So if you go to this example and index.html, the way that we're attaching this this JavaScript library to our sketch is in index.html and in the head. So all you need is this script, this line of code here, to be attached to your HTML as well in the head area. And then once you attach it there, then you can create your own graphic user interface using dat.GUI. So once it's attached, then if you go to sketch.js, to create the GUI, you have to create a variable for GUI. And then in setup, we're going to say I'm going to create a new dat.GUI. Then you can attach any different user interface elements to that graphic user interface, the dat.GUI, like add color or add, in this case, this is just a slider value. And you can say create a initialized color for the color picker. This is RGB with opacity. And then pass that into the add color. You can create an initial value for the radius. In this case, it's going to be the radius of the ellipse. And then pass that into the add function too. So we're creating the GUI, and then we're adding different elements to that GUI. You could add more to it if you wanted as well. If we scroll down, we are basically just creating an ellipse and passing in a fill color that's based off of the color in this color picker, and the radius of this ellipse is based off of this slider in this dat.GUI option. So if we play this, then you'll see the GUI at the top. You can change the color. And then you could also change the radius. And then you can draw. So this just gives you a lot more options when it comes to how you want to change your elements. So you can change like the opacity, you can change the colors separately, you can have a drop down for different shapes or different brush types. You can have a button here just for saving. So yeah, there's a lot of different options that you can do with this. And this is the link to the dat.GUI kind of examples and description website where you can learn more about the different features and different add-ons to this graphic user interface to kind of play around with it a little bit more. So that is that. Again, feel free to Slack me or email me if you have any questions, or if you want to write any sort of comments on the YouTube comment section. That would be awesome. So for homework, I basically just want you to play around with creating different brushes, and I also want you to create your own graphic user interface with either buttons or sliders using dat.GUI or the other example I showed you before dat.GUI, to have at least 2 different types of brushes that the user can select and change to create their own drawings. Then I also want you to create your own drawings with your custom piece of software, drawing software, and export at least 2 images to share with us in class next week. All right. Thanks again, and I'll talk to you soon.